The motel room looked cleaner than it had any right to be after a night like that, and that was the detail that bothered Deputy Mark Ellison from the moment he stepped across the threshold. On January 12, 1984, the blizzard that would isolate half of Carbon County descended on Interstate 80 like a closing fist, turning the stretch of highway between Rawlins and Wamsutter into a white tunnel of wind and ice. The High Plains Motor Lodge, 32 rooms of faded turquoise paint and buzzing neon on the eastbound side of exit 184, was one of the few refuges open when the Wyoming Department of Transportation shut the interstate at 6:03 p.m. By midnight, every room with working heat was occupied by truckers, stranded families, and a handful of unlucky salesmen who'd missed the last window of clear road. Room 17, according to the motel ledger, belonged to a 34-year-old pharmaceuticals rep from Denver named Daniel Whitaker. He'd checked in at 7:41 p.m., paying with a company card, signing the registration form in quick, practice strokes that matched the signature on his Colorado driver's license. The clerk on duty, a 19-year-old community college dropout named Jeff Harmon, remembered him as polite, a little tired, and more interested in the weather report than in small talk. "Just need a bed and a television, friend," Dan had said, rubbing the road fatigue from his eyes while the ABC affiliate out of Cheyenne droned about record-low wind chills behind the counter. "And maybe the wake-up call of my life if this storm blows through." Jeff had laughed dutifully and slid the brass key with its cracked plastic fob across the desk. "Room 17's got the best heater in the place," he'd said, repeating the same line he gave everyone assigned to that wing. "If the power holds, you'll be fine." Power had held. Temperature had plummeted. Wind had pushed drifts almost to the motel's ground floor windows. Sometime between 1 o'clock and 3 a.m., according to the utility company's later records, an outage had flickered across part of the grid, but the High Plains Motor Lodge stayed lit. Through the blizzard's howl, guests could hear the constant low hum of the ice machine, the rattling heaters, and the muffled sound of television game shows bleeding from one room to another. At 6:58 a.m., the call from the front desk to room 17 went unanswered. At 7:05, Jeff called again, cradling the brown plastic receiver between shoulder and ear while he poured stale coffee into a chipped mug. No answer. At 7:11, with the snow still coming down and YDOT radio confirming that the interstate would remain closed at least until noon, Jeff grabbed the master keyring and shuffled down the carpeted hallway, past doors with do not disturb signs and the smell of cigarettes leaking under thresholds. What he found when he opened room 17 would haunt him for the rest of his life. The television was on volume low, broadcasting the tail end of a late-night Western rerun. The bed was made so perfectly the sheets looked ironed, hospital corners still tight, blankets smooth. On the nightstand, a plastic motel glass sat upright with a faint ring of water at the bottom, condensation dried into a pale line. The bathroom light was on, door half closed. In the sink, a disposable razor lay next to a bar of motel soap worn down only slightly, as if used for a single quick wash. A navy suit jacket hung from the closet's lone wire hanger, a pressed white shirt folded on the shelf above it. On the small round table by the window, a leather briefcase rested shut, combination lock still set to 000 untouched. There was no sign of a struggle. No overturned chairs, no scattered papers, nothing. But there was also no sign of Dan. No shoes under the bed. No coat on the back of the chair. No overnight bag. No damp footprints on the carpet. No wet gloves draped over the heater's metal grill. The room looked like it had been staged for a photograph, frozen in the moment before a guest ever arrived. The only proof that someone had been there at all was the impression on the bedspread, a faint depression in the cheap floral pattern where, according to later forensic measurements, someone had sat for exactly long enough to crease the polyester and then stand up again. Jeff stood in the doorway for several seconds, his brain struggling to reconcile the ledger in his hand with the emptiness in front of him. Then training, such as it was, kicked in. He knocked on the open door and called out the guest's name, the sound of his own voice startling him. "Mr. Whitaker?" "Sir." "Nothing." The bathroom was empty. The tub was dry. The mirror above the sink still held the ghost of steam from some earlier use, streaked where a hand might have wiped across it hours before. Thinking that maybe the guest had slipped outside to smoke or to check on his car, Jeff moved to the window, careful not to disturb anything, and pulled back the heavy gold curtain an inch. The outside world was a white wall. Beyond the glass, the parking lot was buried, plowed only in a rough channel to the edge of the property. Dan's rental Oldsmobile, a white Cutlass with a Denver airport sticker, sat in the same spot it had occupied the night before, according to Jeff's memory, 2 spaces from the room, nose pointed toward the highway, windshield half buried in snow that had drifted up over the hood. The driver's door was closed. All doors were. No footprints. No tire tracks. No sign of anyone going to or from the car since the storm had fully set in. But it wasn't the view that made Jeff's hand tighten on the curtain fabric. It was the window itself. The lock was engaged. The old aluminum frame, slightly warped, painted and repainted by the motel owner's brother, sat flush in its track. When Jeff pushed experimentally, the glass rattled but didn't move. Later, when crime scene techs measured and photographed every inch of the sill, they'd note how a thin line of snow had built up on the outside lip, undisturbed, like sugar dusted over the metal. If that window had been opened at any point after the blizzard reached full strength, they said, the pattern would have changed. It hadn't. The door, Jeff realized, his pulse suddenly loud in his ears. He turned, looked at the inside knob, and felt the first flicker of fear. The swing bar lock was thrown. The narrow strip of chrome sat firmly in its receiving plate, as if someone had latched it from inside and never unlatched it again. Jeff had opened the door easily because the swing bar had been hanging loose a moment earlier, but the memory of what he'd actually done blurred in his panic. Later, when detectives walked him through his movements again and again, he'd admit that he might have flipped the bar loose himself in the same motion that pushed the door inward, muscle memory overriding attention. The motel's swing bars were old, cheap, and occasionally stuck in the closed position even when dangling free. The detail would become a point of endless debate for years. For now, Jeff only knew one thing clearly: the room should not have been empty. The ledger on his clipboard said it was occupied. The credit card slip, signed in blue ink, said it was occupied. The car outside said it was occupied. Yet there was no occupant. Trying to tamp down the rising sense of unreality, Jeff backed into the hallway, pulling the door shut carefully, and went straight to the payphone mounted behind the front desk. The sheriff's office dispatcher answered on the second ring. Carbon County Sheriff's. This is Karen. Jeff swallowed hard. Yeah, this is Jeff at the High Plains Motor Lodge. I think I've got a problem with one of my rooms. Deputy Mark Ellison arrived 34 minutes later, fighting the wind every step from his patrol car to the lobby. He was 29 years old, 6 years into the job, with a wife and a 6-month-old daughter at home and a growing sense that the quiet rural posting he'd once appreciated had become a rut. The blizzard had kept him up most of the night, dealing with spinouts and stranded motorists at the I-80 closure, but a missing guest at a motel sounded, in his experience, like nothing more than a hungover trucker ignoring a wake-up call. Carbon County didn't get the kind of crime that made television. It got bar fights and bad checks and the occasional teenage runaway who usually turned up in Cheyenne pretending to be older than she was. Still, procedure was procedure. He signed the motel's incident log, noted the time, 8:02 a.m., and followed Jeff down the hallway, boots squeaking on the carpet. "Just walk me through it," Ellison said, voice calm. "What made you call us instead of just charging him for another night?" Jeff's answer tumbled out in nervous fragments. The unanswered wake-up call, the empty room, the locked window, the car still outside. Ellison listened, half-occupied with mental checklists. Welfare check, possible medical emergency, maybe the guy slipped in the tub and was lying behind the door where Jeff hadn't seen him. When they reached room 17, Ellison had Jeff step aside and knocked firmly. "Sheriff's office," he called. "Mr. Whitaker, are you in there?" Silence. He tried again, louder. Nothing but the low murmur of the television bleeding through the thin door. Ellison used the master key and opened the door 2 inches, then stopped, eye-catching on the swing bar's position. It was hanging free now, he'd see that clearly in his report, but the metal still bore the faint scuff mark where it had once rested in its catch. For a brief moment, the fact registered as unimportant. He pushed the door open, announced himself again, and stepped into a room that felt immediately wrong. The air held a lingering hint of aftershave and the chemical sweetness of motel cleaner, but there was no human presence, no warmth. The bed, the table, the briefcase, the bathroom, all arranged in a tableau that would be photographed from every angle over the next 48 hours. Ellison did a slow, methodical sweep, opening the closet, checking the underbed space, pulling back the shower curtain. Nothing. He checked the window, his gloved fingers pressing along the sill, testing the lock. Secure. When he looked outside, the pattern of snow in the lot matched what Jeff had described, drifted, wind-carved, untouched save for the frozen tire ruts from the cars that had arrived before the closure. No fresh footprints, no disturbed drifts. The Oldsmobile's doors were still closed, side mirrors coated in ice. He asked Jeff for the registration slip, then cross-referenced the name with dispatch. Within 15 minutes, they had the basics. Daniel Whitaker, age 34, employed by Rocky Mountain Pharmaceutical Distributors out of Denver. No outstanding warrants, no known criminal history. Married, with 1 child, according to the Colorado DMV emergency contact form. Ellison felt the unease in his stomach sharpen into something more focused. Married meant someone would miss him quickly. Someone would call if he didn't check in. "You sure you didn't see him leave?" Ellison asked, turning back to Jeff. The clerk shook his head emphatically. "I mean, people come and go, you know? But the highway's closed. Nobody's going anywhere. And I was on till 2. I never saw the door open after he checked in." And he hesitated, glancing at the bed. He didn't mess up the room at all. Ellison followed his gaze. Something about the smooth bedspread nagged at him. "Housekeeping been in here this morning?" "No, sir. I don't send them in till after checkout. Besides, Nancy called, said she couldn't get her car started in this mess. I'm solo till at least noon." Ellison radioed for backup anyway. Sheriff's investigator Ruth Calhoun, who'd been with the department long enough to remember when the High Plains Motor Lodge was still called the Prairie Star, arrived just before 9, a compact woman in her mid-40s with tired eyes and a reputation for seeing patterns other people missed. She stepped into room 17, took in the bed, the television, the briefcase and the empty air, and felt the hair rise along her arms under her uniform jacket. "All right," she said quietly. "Let's treat this like a crime scene until we know it isn't." Within an hour, the parking lot of the High Plains Motor Lodge looked like something out of a big city crime drama, at least by Carbon County standards. 2 additional patrol cars, a state trooper's Ford, and a Wyoming Division of Criminal Investigation van fought the drifting snow for space. Yellow tape went up across the hallway, cutting off rooms 15 through 19. Guests grumbled, leaning out of other doors to watch as investigators in booties and gloves filed into room 17, filling the small space with cameras, evidence bags, fingerprint kits. The motel's owner, a barrel-chested man in his 60s named Arlen Red Kellerman, paced the lobby, muttering about lost revenue and bad publicity under his breath. "You're telling me a guy just vanished from one of my rooms," he said for the 4th time, voice rising. "You know what that's gonna do to business? People hear about this. They'll go sleep in their cars before they stay here." Calhoun stood at the front desk with her notebook open, ignoring his panic. "Mr. Kellerman, I need your records for the last 72 hours, she said. "Every guest, every room change, every maintenance log, every phone call if you've got it. And I need you to think very carefully. Was there anybody hanging around here last night who wasn't a guest?" Red scrubbed a hand over his face. "It was a blizzard," he snapped. "Only people out there were idiots and truckers. Everybody came in, signed the book, got their keys, and disappeared behind their doors. Nobody's cruising for trouble in that kind of weather, for Christ's sake." "People commit crimes in bad weather all the time," Calhoun said evenly. "Snow doesn't stop them. Sometimes it helps them." Fewer witnesses. When she went back to room 17, the techs had finished their initial sweep. No obvious blood. No hairs that didn't match motel housekeeping's known samples. Fingerprints on the remote control, the bathroom faucet, the closet door, and the briefcase's handle that would later be attributed to one of 3 people, the guest, the clerk, or housekeeping. The only anomaly, if it could be called that, was the absence of certain things. No toothbrush, no shaving kit, no change of clothes beyond the suit jacket and shirt, no half-eaten food, no empty soda cans, no cigarette butts. Most travelers, especially those stranded unexpectedly, left a trail of minor clutter behind them. Dan Whitaker had left behind almost nothing. The briefcase was the one piece of personal property that seemed promising. With Red reluctantly signing a consent form to allow the combination lock to be bypassed, a tech popped it open using a thin torsion bar and a practice twist. Inside were neatly organized folders with sales reports, mileage logs, a spiral notebook with territory notes, and a small zippered pouch containing sample medication blister packs. No cash. No personal letters. No hint of an impending disappearance. Later, under the harsh fluorescent lights of the sheriff's office, those papers would be combed for hidden messages, strange patterns, names that might connect to missing persons in other states. For now, they told a simpler, more mundane story. A man doing his job, driving countless miles across the High Plains to persuade small-town doctors to prescribe his company's drugs. The first call to Denver went out at 10:23 a.m. Calhoun reached Whitaker's employer, then his home number. His wife, Laura, answered on the second ring. The conversation between a Wyoming investigator and a woman 300 miles away, whose reality was about to be shattered, would be reconstructed later from notes and memory. How Laura's tone shifted from pleasantly distracted to confused to frightened in the space of 30 seconds. How she insisted that Dan had called her from the road at 5:30 p.m. the night before to say he was trying to beat the storm into Rawlins but might have to stop. How she said he'd promised to call again from his motel before going to sleep, and how that second call never came. He'd missed check-ins before, she admitted, but never by more than a couple of hours. Never without a reason. Calhoun told her carefully that they had his car, his room, and his belongings. She did not use the word missing yet. That would come later, when the hours ticked by with no sign of footprints, no witnesses who'd seen a man walking out into a blizzard. While the storm raged outside, the first timeline of Dan's final known movements took shape on a legal pad in the motel's small conference room. 5:38 p.m. Pays for gas at a station west of Rawlins, according to the credit card company. 6:03 p.m. YDOT closes the interstate. Troopers direct vehicles off at exit 184. 7:41 p.m. Checks into High Plains Motor Lodge, room 17, as documented by the ledger. 8:10 p.m. Approximately, Jeff remembers seeing him exit the vending room with a soda and a bag of chips. After that, the line goes blank. No more recorded transactions. No calls from the room phone, according to the motel's internal log. No witnesses who distinctly remember seeing him again. No one heard a struggle through the thin walls. No one saw a door open to empty hallway. The blizzard had provided a kind of anonymity blanket. Everyone was too busy staying warm and alive to notice one man's routine. By late afternoon, when the sky began to clear and YDOT crews moved in with plows to carve channels through the drifts, the mystery of room 17 had already begun to spread beyond the motel. Drivers at the truck stop across the highway passed along their version of events over coffee. Some guy gone from a locked room, just up and vanished, probably skipped out on the bill. At Rosita's diner in town, waitresses told the story differently. A traveling salesman taken by the storm, body somewhere out there under the snow, poor bastard. At the sheriff's office, behind closed doors, the narrative was more precise but no less unsettling. People didn't disappear from sealed rooms. Not in real life. Not without leaving something. A trace, a fiber, a scuff mark, a witness. Yet every line of inquiry that first day ended at the same blank wall. Between 7:41 p.m. and the unanswered wake-up call, there was simply nothing. No one saw Daniel Whitaker leave room 17. No one saw him walk toward his car or the lobby or the highway. No one saw anyone else enter his room. But by the time the storm clouds lifted, it was already clear that whatever had happened in that motel during the long January night would not be explained easily. The door to room 17 had been locked when Jeff first approached, he insisted. The key worked as it should. The window lock was engaged, the frame undisturbed. There was no adjoining door. Room 17 shared two walls with 16 and 18, both of which were occupied by truckers who swore they heard nothing but the television and the wind. The ceiling was solid. The floor, concrete slab. No crawl spaces. No hidden passages. In the days and weeks to come, every inch of that building would be examined, measured, and sketched. Engineers would be consulted about structural anomalies. Conspiracy theorists would call with wild suggestions about trapdoors and tunnel systems. But on that first day, under the fluorescent buzz of the motel's hallway and the fading echo of the blizzard outside, what Carbon County law enforcement had was something that didn't fit anywhere in their training manuals. A man who went into a motel room known to be secure, and who, as far as anyone could tell, never came out. Years later, investigators and armchair detectives alike would argue that the case began to go wrong in those first 24 hours because nobody in Rawlins had a mental category labeled impossible crime. They had categories for domestic disputes and bar fights, for drifters who stole from unattended pickups at gas stations, for hunters who went missing in the Medicine Bow National Forest and were found months later when the thaw came. They did not have a category for locked room vanishing acts. So the questions they asked, the assumptions they made, were shaped by a world where doors meant something, where locks worked, where snow remembered every footstep laid upon it. In that world, the obvious explanation was the only explanation. If a man was gone, he must have left. The fact that no one could yet explain how would be, for the moment, a secondary concern. As night fell again on January 12th, room 17 remained sealed behind evidence tape, its blinds drawn, its television dark. Out on I-80, the plows pushed through, and the interstate reopened to limited traffic, the day's crisis declared over by highway authorities. But for the Whitaker family in Denver, for the staff of the High Plains Motor Lodge, and for a handful of Carbon County investigators staring at a case file that already felt like a contradiction, the storm had left something behind in its wake, an absence shaped like a man, in a room that should have been unremarkable, in a motel that would never again be just another stop along the interstate. It would take decades for that absence to be filled with anything even resembling answers. By the second morning after the blizzard, room 17 had become the gravitational center of the High Plains Motor Lodge, drawing investigators, rumor, and dread into its orbit with an intensity that Red Kellerman could hardly tolerate. Sheriff's investigator Ruth Calhoun arrived before dawn, coffee in hand, boots still wet from trudging through drifts in the parking lot, and stepped back into a room that felt more like a paradox than a crime scene. She stood just inside the threshold, absorbing again the eerie orderliness, the unrumpled sheets, the silent television, the untouched briefcase, and felt the same pulse of disbelief she'd felt the day before. Real life didn't allow for vanishings. Magicians did vanishings. Fiction did. Not Carbon County. And certainly not in a room sealed by a door lock so old its screws were rusted into the frame. The Wyoming Division of Criminal Investigation Team returned at 7:14 a.m., carrying additional kits, luminol, alternate light sources, microvacuum devices. Their lead tech, a 38-year-old meticulous ex-engineer named Paul Hardesty, was determined to extract something, anything, that might counter the growing suspicion that the scene was offering them nothing because there was nothing to find. Hardesty began with the carpet, moving slowly in overlapping grids, the vacuum whispering as it collected invisible particles. He took fiber samples from the bedspread, swabbed the bathroom counter, collected scrapings from under the sink's metal rim. When he finished, he stood with Calhoun near the heater, reviewing preliminary impressions. "There's no transfer," he said quietly. "No trace from another person. No indicators of violence. No biologicals. If something happened to him in here, it left no footprint." Calhoun nodded slowly, her jaw tight. "People don't evaporate, Paul." "No," he agreed, voice low. "They don't." The highway reopened fully that afternoon. Snowplows carved the last narrow channel through the westbound lanes, and cars began moving again. But even as stranded travelers trickled out of the motel, the story of the salesman who vanished from a locked room began spreading. Guests whispered about it while hauling bags to their cars, truckers muttered about it over thermoses before heading back onto 80, and by evening the case had made its way onto the CB radios of half a dozen long haulers crossing southern Wyoming. By nightfall, the Rawlins police dispatcher had fielded 13 calls, one claiming to have seen a man matching Whitaker's description hitchhiking near Table Rock in the storm, another insisting they'd served him pie at a Sinclair diner hours before, and several others offering sightings so vague and contradictory that none merited a follow-up. Meanwhile, the High Plains Motor Lodge settled back into an uneasy imitation of normalcy. Rooms 15 and 19 reopened. Room 18 remained sealed until morning. Room 17 would not take another guest for months. Yet the sense of dread, the unease in the very walls, persisted. The office smelled of burnt coffee and Red's cheap cologne as Calhoun sat behind the counter reviewing the day's notes. Jeff, bleary-eyed, hovered nearby, unable to resist re-examining the events that had triggered everything. "I keep thinking I missed something," he murmured. "Maybe he left while I wasn't looking. Maybe I—" "No," Calhoun interrupted firmly. "Don't rewrite the timeline because it feels impossible. Stick to what you saw." "What I saw was a room no one walked out of." Calhoun didn't respond, because she had no answer to that, no rational explanation, no comforting counterpoint. No one walked out of that room. No one walked to the car. Yet the man who had occupied that room was gone. At 6:42 p.m., an unexpected break came through the radio. "Sheriff's office, this is Ellis at the impound," the voice crackled. "We finished thawing the Oldsmobile. You're gonna want to come down here." The impound garage, a squat concrete structure near the county yard, held the Cutlass inside its heated bay, beads of melted snow pooling beneath the steel bumper. The windshield had defrosted, the interior had warmed, and every surface looked as clean and undisturbed as the motel room had. Hardesty stood with Ellison beside the open driver's door, both men staring at the dashboard with the same troubled expression. Calhoun approached, heart thudding. "What is it?" Hardesty pointed toward the ignition. The key was still in it. Not just in it, turned halfway. "Accessory mode. Battery was dead when we picked it up," Ellison said. "But once we jumped it, the clock came on. It's off by 8 hours. Calhoun frowned. 8 hours ahead or behind? "Ahead," Hardesty said, "meaning someone turned the key sometime around 3 in the morning. Well, after the storm peak." "Could have been Whitaker," Ellison suggested. "Maybe he planned to go back out." "Through 2 feet of snow in a blizzard," Hardesty countered. "In dress shoes? With no coat missing from the room." Calhoun leaned in, examining the dashboard. Something else was wrong. The radio was switched to AM, tuned to a frequency between stations. "White noise. Who listens to static?" she murmured. Hardesty shook his head, baffled. "Unless he was trying to pick up weather alerts, or," Ellison interrupted. "Rear seats clean. Trunk too. No signs he stored gear. No footprints in the snow by the doors. Nothing." Calhoun circled the car, running her gloved hand along the trunk seal. Her mind worked through the possibilities, then dismissed them almost as quickly. No one could have opened the car in that storm without disturbing the snow. No one could have reached it unseen. No one could have done any of this without leaving the smallest trace. Which means whatever happened to him, she said quietly, happened before he got back to the car. But even that explanation collapsed under its own weight. He'd never left the room. Back at the sheriff's office, Calhoun sat across from a grim-faced Sheriff Don Tyrrell as evening deepened around the building. Tyrrell was a blunt man with a thinning hairline, a permanently furrowed brow, and an unshakable belief in causality. He listened as she reviewed the timeline, the car's ignition anomaly, the empty room. When she finished, he set his pen down and exhaled slowly. "What you're describing isn't possible." Calhoun stared at him, exhausted. "I know. Then your timeline is wrong." "It's not." "Then your witness is wrong. Jeff's not lying. And he's not confused." "Then someone else had a key. We collected every master key on the property. All accounted for. Only Jeff and the cleaning crew had access after check-in. And housekeeping never entered." Tyrrell rubbed his temples. "People don't vanish. They make choices. Bad ones sometimes. Sometimes fatal ones." He didn't walk out. Not through a locked window. Not through a snow-covered walkway. Not through a door no one saw open. Tyrrell leaned back, defeated by the logic. "Then you're asking me to accept that a man disappeared into thin air." Calhoun's voice lowered. "I'm asking you to accept that something happened we don't understand yet." The room fell silent, save for the hum of the radiator. Outside, snowplows scraped the last remnants of the storm from Cedar Street. Somewhere down the road, dogs barked at the cold. In Denver, a woman named Laura Whitaker paced her living room, phone in hand, waiting for a call that would bring answers but only bring new terror. Calhoun ran the timeline again in her mind, trying to find the seam, the point where reality might have slipped. The vending room visit at 8:10 p.m. The silent TV. The immaculate bed. The briefcase. The half-turned key in the ignition. The undisturbed snow. The room locked from inside. She felt, for the first time in her career, a cold that had nothing to do with the Wyoming winter seeping into her bones. By midnight, the motel was quiet again, but room 17 radiated tension like static electricity behind the thin barrier of yellow tape. Investigators cleared out for the night. Jeff sat alone at the front desk, scared to look down the hallway. And in the sheriff's office, Calhoun closed her case file gently, as if afraid the pages themselves might crumble. Somewhere in this web of contradictions was a truth. Somewhere in the patterns of snow, in the silence of that room, in the final actions of a man who should not have been able to disappear, lay an answer that would not surface for decades. For now, carbon. County held its breath. The wind settled. The roads reopened. But the motel on exit 184 had already shifted into a different category of place. Not just a shelter from storms, not just a roadside stop, but the site of an impossibility that would echo across Wyoming for years. By the third day, the High Plains Motor Lodge felt less like a roadside refuge and more like a pressure chamber. Investigators came and went through the sliding glass lobby doors, their boots leaving tracks that melted slowly on the thin brown carpet. Guests avoided the hallway leading to room 17 altogether, walking the long way around the building for ice, vending machines, or conversation. Red Kellerman hovered behind the front desk, arms crossed, watching his property become the center of a mystery he never wanted and couldn't control. Sheriff's investigator Ruth Calhoun spent the morning interviewing guests who had stayed the night of the storm. She worked methodically, notebook open, pen moving in the same neat shorthand she'd used since academy training. A trucker in room 12 remembered hearing the wind howl all night and nothing else. A sales rep in room 22 recalled seeing a man in a navy suit walk past his window around 8 o'clock. Though when pressed for specifics he couldn't be sure if it was actually the same man who checked into room 17 or simply another stranded traveler. Two teenage brothers in room 19 remembered the walls shaking from the blizzard, but insisted they never heard voices, footsteps, or anything unusual through the thin drywall they shared with Whitaker's room. No one had a reliable sighting past 9 p.m. No one heard a door open. No one saw a shadow move under the crack in the hallway light. The motel's heating system hummed steadily as Calhoun moved from room to room, but an icy hollowness sat behind the walls. The blizzard had ended, the mystery had not. Around 11, a state trooper named John Veazey pulled Calhoun aside near the ice machine. "We've got something," he said quietly. Not sure what to make of it. He led her through the back corridor, out the rear exit, and across the now-plowed parking lot to the edge of the property where the snow had drifted deepest. The windbreaker he wore snapped sharply as he pointed toward a packed wall of snow along the fence line. That's where the plow pushed everything yesterday, he said. County guys carved out a channel. But one of the snowbank layers, it looked off. Calhoun crouched, staring at the uneven strata, compressed layers of storm snowfall now cut vertically by the plow. VZ traced a gloved finger along a faint indentation, a diagonal swallow in the otherwise horizontal layers. This ridge, he said. It wasn't formed by wind. Calhoun leaned closer. The indentation ran across about 18 inches of depth, a smooth, uniform depression that suggested pressure, not erosion. Something had pressed against the snowbank before the plow had pushed the drift forward. Not a handprint. Not a footprint. Something broader. When was this section cleared? She asked. Yesterday afternoon, maybe 4 p.m.? Meaning the imprint was made between the storm peak and plowing. Right. Could it be from someone falling into the drift? VZ shook his head. No scuff marks. No post-storm collapse. Looks like it was pressed from the inside. Calhoun felt a flicker of unease. Inside what? That's the thing. Inside the drift. She stood slowly, looking at the line of snowbanks stretching along the fence like white tombs. If someone had walked into that drift, we'd see the tracks. Exactly, VZ said. But there's nothing. The depression wasn't deep enough to suggest a body. But it wasn't incidental, either. Someone or something had displaced the snow during the storm in a way the wind could not have achieved. Calhoun ordered the entire snowbank section to be cut, removed, and examined layer by layer. By early afternoon, county workers with shovels and flat spades carved it into blocks, carrying chunks into a heated maintenance shed while investigators diagrammed each piece. Nothing surfaced in the first 6 layers. The 7th revealed a faint, partial impression of something textured, too regular to be natural, too vague to classify. By the 10th layer, an investigator held up a translucent plane of ice and tilted it under the overhead lights. Calhoun stepped closer. Encased within the frozen sheet, barely visible beneath the cloudy surface, was a fabric thread. Deep navy, less than an inch long. From a coat? Someone asked. From clothing, another suggested. But the thread was too thin to be conclusive, too generic to match. And buried in the snow, it meant nothing without context. They bagged it anyway. At 3 o'clock, a new complication arrived. The Denver Police Department had sent a missing person liaison to coordinate with Carbon County. Detective Raul Cortez, a calm, detail-oriented investigator with 20 years' experience and an unwavering loyalty to procedure. Laura Whitaker was distraught, he explained, but cooperative. She had provided a list of Dan's co-workers, family members, and recent contacts. She insisted there was no reason for him to leave voluntarily. No depression, no financial stress, no affair. Cortez walked room 17 with Calhoun. The two investigators stood together in the stale air, facing the bed as though the room itself might speak if observed long enough. This is wrong, he said finally. Rooms don't look like this unless someone intended them to look like this. Staged, Calhoun murmured. Yes. Cortez gestured around the space. A man travels through a blizzard, checks into a motel, buys a soda, goes to his room. If he planned to run, ditch his life, he'd take clothes, papers, cash, car keys. But if he planned to stay, he'd unpack something, move something, eat something, touch something more than this. A room like this is a photograph, static, fixed, purposeful. Calhoun nodded. But staged by who? That's your Wyoming mystery, Cortez said. In Denver, when something looks staged, someone did the staging. No sign of entry. Then they had a key. All accounted for. Then they didn't need a key. Explain that. Cortez didn't. Instead, he scanned the room again, brow furrowing. You said the ignition was halfway turned? Yes. That's not accidental. That's intentional. Calhoun agreed. And the AM static. And the untouched briefcase. And the depression in the snowbank. All fragments pointing nowhere. That evening, the first round of forensic results arrived. No blood. No biological trace. No foreign fingerprints beyond what had been expected. The navy thread was cotton, mass-produced, untraceable. Room 17, it appeared, was a void. At 8:19 p.m., a trucker who'd stayed in room 28 the night of the storm called from Evanston after hearing rumors on the CB. He claimed he'd heard a noise sometime around 2 a.m., 3 rhythmic thumps, like someone banging on a wall. He thought nothing of it then, assuming it was pipes or a neighbor. The problem was that room 28 sat at the far end of the building, nowhere near room 17, and the layout had no shared plumbing lines between the walls. But he insisted. 3 thumps. evenly spaced, like someone knocking through drywall. Calhoun noted it, but didn't incorporate it. It made no sense. Everything made no sense. Around midnight, she stepped outside, letting the cold snap her awake. The wind had died to a whisper. The sky above Rawlins glittered with the kind of sharp winter stars that seemed carved out of ice. She walked the length of the motel, boots crunching in the refrozen snow, and looked up at the row of windows facing the highway. Room 17's curtains were drawn. The darkness behind them felt heavy, wrong, hollow. She thought of the snow layers, the indentation, the thread. She thought of the untouched room, the car with its half-turned key, the silence in the walls. And she thought of Daniel Whitaker walking into room 17 at 7:41 p.m., locking the door, settling in for a night of storm shelter, and then vanishing into a space with no exit. "People don't disappear," she whispered into the frost. By then she had repeated the phrase so often it no longer felt like a fact, only a hope. What she did not yet know, what would take years to understand, was that the case was already diverging from the boundaries of the explainable. That a second event, smaller, quieter, easily dismissed at the time, had occurred just 48 miles east of the motel at nearly the same hour Whitaker vanished. A CB transmission caught by a trucker outside Elk Mountain. A faint voice buried in static saying something that would later be matched to Whitaker's vocal patterns. Or that 10 years later, during another January storm, a guest in room 17 would make a report eerily similar to the trucker's. 3 thumps behind the wall, evenly spaced, impossible to trace. For now, Calhoun tucked her hands deeper into her coat and stared at the horizon, which glowed faintly with the reflection of sodium highway lights. She did not know that this case would grow colder each year but never settle, never rest, never fade. That the High Plains Motor Lodge would become a place people avoided at night, a place whispered about in truck stops, a place where no one requested room 17 voluntarily. She walked back inside, the lobby door clicking shut behind her, sealing in the motel's stale heat and the weight of a mystery that was only beginning to reveal its edges. The 4th day of the investigation began not at the High Plains Motor Lodge but at the Carbon County Sheriff's Office, where investigator Ruth Calhoun sat in an interrogation room staring at a wall-mounted map of the region. A red pin marked the motel. Blue pins marked every property along exit 184. A single yellow pin, added at dawn, sat 48 miles east, near Elk Mountain, where a trucker named Harris Dobson claimed he'd picked up a strange CB transmission during the height of the storm. At first, Calhoun had dismissed the report as blizzard interference, CB chatter garbled by wind and atmospheric static. But Dobson insisted he'd heard a voice. Male, Midwestern accent, faint, like someone calling from far away or through heavy interference. And the phrase he swore he heard, half swallowed by static, had made her stop dismissing anything. Room 17. He'd played the recording from his dash-mounted CB log. Most of it was noise, the roar of the storm, electrical crackle, Dobson's own hum of highway boredom. Then faintly, buried in static like a voice underwater, 17 not safe. The timestamp aligned almost perfectly with the moment the storm peaked in Rawlins. Around 2:03 a.m., the same hour the ignition on Whitaker's car had been mysteriously turned to accessory mode. She replayed the clip now, headphones pressed tight, listening again and again for a moment that could be rationalized. She wanted misheard syllables. She wanted interference. She wanted a simpler explanation than what her mind offered. But the words remained, indistinct but shaped. A murmur in the storm. She set the headphones down and stared at the table. She should have laughed it off, should have marked it irrelevant. But the indentation in the snowbank had been irrelevant. The navy thread had been irrelevant. The half-turned ignition, the perfect room, the silence behind the walls, irrelevant. Too much irrelevance was starting to look like pattern. She drove to the motel. The morning sun cast pale gold across the snow still packed along the curbs. Room 17's curtains remained drawn. The yellow evidence tape fluttered faintly. She unlocked the room, stepped inside, and let the silence close around her like a fist. The air held the same scent, old carpet, motel cleaner, a faint trace of aftershave that seemed stronger now than it had been days earlier. She looked toward the heater. It was off, yet the air felt warm. Warmer than the rest of the hallway. Heat from the closed room? Or something else? She crossed to the table and laid out her files. Timeline, witness statements, photographs. The bed still creased where Whitaker had sat. The nightstand with its faint water ring. The closet containing the jacket and shirt. The bathroom as sterile as a display unit. She spread the photographs across the table. Snowbank layers. Car dashboard. Window lock. But her eyes kept drifting to the wall between room 17 and room 18. A plain wall. beige paint, cheap motel texture. She walked to it and placed her palm flat against it. Nothing. No vibration. No sound. Deep in the structure, the building hummed with electrical current and heating ducts, but nothing unusual. She pressed her ear to the wall. Silence. Total. The kind that pressed inward. She stepped back and sat on the bed, sinking slightly into the depression Whitaker had left. The room held its breath around her. At 11:46 a.m., investigator Ellison arrived. He knocked once and entered quietly. "You should see this," he said. "From Denver." She followed him to the lobby, where he handed her a manila envelope sent by overnight courier. Inside were photocopies of Daniel Whitaker's recent phone records. One number appeared 3 times in the week before his disappearance. It belonged to a Dr. Ira Connolly, a physician near Fort Collins. Connolly had requested samples from Whitaker's pharmaceutical company and placed unusually large orders of a new sedative that had raised corporate flags. Connolly also ran a private sleep research practice on the side. "What does that have to do with a motel disappearance?" Ellison asked. Calhoun didn't know, but she called. Connolly answered, groggy, annoyed. When she introduced herself, the annoyance sharpened. "I told your Denver people everything already," he said. "I placed an order. Supplier delayed it. Whitaker handled logistics. That's it." "Did he say where he was going after he spoke to you?" "No." "Did he sound distressed?" "Nervous. He sounded tired." "Tired how?" Connolly paused. "Like he hadn't slept in days." "Did he say anything else?" "He mentioned he'd had a string of strange nights on the road. Said he kept waking up in motel rooms feeling like he'd been walking in his sleep." "Sleepwalking." "That's what I asked," Connolly replied. "He said no. Said he'd wake up exhausted, sheets messed up, shoes moved, like he'd been doing something without remembering. Concerned it was side effects from long driving shifts. I told him to see his primary physician." "And when was this?" 3 nights before he vanished." Calhoun hung up, the receiver cold against her hand. She stood still for a long moment, then went back to room 17. She opened the briefcase, pulled out the spiral notebook. She had skimmed it earlier but not read every page. Now she did. The notes were ordinary, client reminders, mileage tallies, until 3 pages near the back. One had a short line written in shaky handwriting. "Woke up. Sitting on edge of bed but don't remember moving another. Felt like someone shaking the mattress. No one there. Maybe storm? No storm tonight." And the last, written the day before he disappeared. "Kept hearing tapping in walls at Sagebrush Inn. 3 taps. Paused. 3 taps again. Asked front desk. Said no adjoining room. Worried I'm getting sick. Something feels off." Calhoun closed her eyes. 3 taps. Evenly spaced. She opened her eyes again to the nearly perfect room. No disturbed sheets. No signs of restlessness. No signs he'd woken suddenly. No signs of anything. But the notes painted a different picture. Something had been wrong before Rawlins. Before the storm. Before room 17. At 4:07 p.m., an electrician arrived to inspect the wall between 17 and 18. Measuring tools. Stud finders. Infrared sensors. He scanned for anomalies. Pockets. Voids. Unaccounted structures. "Nothing unusual," he said. "Standard studs, insulation, wiring, nothing else. No crawlspace. No service access." "What about older construction?" Calhoun asked. "Any chance of patched-over doorways? Sealed vents?" "Not likely. But I can bring a thermal camera tomorrow." By evening, the motel emptied out again. Only 3 rooms were occupied. Snowplows drifted past on the frontage road. The air carried that muted, after-storm hush that made every sound feel amplified. Calhoun sat alone in room 17 with a small desk lamp illuminating the space. She replayed Dobson's CB clip on her handheld recorder. The static filled the room like wind pushing at thin walls. Then that faint, distorted murmur. 17 not safe. She turned the volume up. The static thickened. The murmuring sank deeper. Either nonsense or warning. She shut it off. She stood and crossed the room to the heater. Her hand hovered above it. The metal was warmer than expected for a unit turned off. She pressed her palm to the wall again. Nothing. She moved to the bathroom, looking at the mirror, the sink, the razor. She looked at the shower drain. Something about the drain made her pause. A metal ring. Stainless steel. Clean. Too clean. She crouched. Ran a finger around the rim. No grime. No soap scum. No mineral dust. as if it had been scrubbed aggressively, as if something had been washed down. She opened the cabinet beneath the sink, empty except for an old yellowed motel maintenance sticker. She stood, walked back to the wall, and placed both hands flat against it. The room felt heavier, warmer, more closed. Her breath fogged faintly even though the air was warm. She listened. Nothing. Then, something so faint she almost doubted it. A soft vibration. Not a sound. A feeling. Through the drywall. Through the studs. Through the space between. A thrum. Calhoun pressed her ear to the wall. No pipes. No heaters. No mechanical hum. Just 3 faint, evenly spaced taps. She froze. Her heartbeat slammed in her chest. 3 taps. Then silence. Then nothing. She stayed pressed to the wall for another full minute. Nothing more came. She backed away, breath shaking, and stared at the beige paint as though it might stare back. She knew then that whatever had happened to Daniel Whitaker had not ended. Not with him. Not with the storm. Not with the sealed room. Room 17 wasn't just the scene of a disappearance. It was still active, still repeating, still echoing something she could not explain. The room held its breath, and Calhoun held hers, too. By the 5th day, the investigation into Daniel Whitaker's disappearance had stopped behaving like an investigation and started behaving like a haunting. Investigator Ruth Calhoun did not use that word aloud. It was imprecise, unprofessional, and unacceptable within the sheriff's office, but the sensation had grown in her chest like a slow, tightening knot. No matter how many times she entered room 17, the air felt wrong, the temperature uneven, the silence thicker than any silence had a right to be. And she kept hearing those taps. 3. Evenly spaced. Not every time. Not at predictable hours. But enough that she no longer questioned her senses. Something in the walls was moving, or knocking, or answering. She refused to consider that last possibility. At 7:12 a.m., the motel's owner, Red Kellerman, stormed into the lobby holding a stack of legal papers. His face was mottled, his voice sharp with panic. "I've got guests canceling reservations," he snapped the moment he saw her. "Truckers are spreading rumors all over the interstate. People are saying someone's body is in the walls. They're saying this place is cursed." "Rumors don't concern me," Calhoun replied, pulling on her gloves. "I need access to room 3, room 5, and room 7. I want to examine construction symmetry. You're tearing my business apart. I'm trying to figure out what happened here. What happened is your department can't find a goddamn man who walked out in the storm." "He didn't walk out," Calhoun cut in. "He didn't leave that room." Red's mouth opened, then closed. For the first time, she saw fear behind his anger. She stepped past him without another word. In room 3, she measured wall thickness with a digital caliper. In room 5, she checked heater temperatures. In room 7, she removed the outlet cover and shined a flashlight inside the wall cavity. Nothing. Perfectly ordinary construction. No hidden voids. No unusual structural modifications. Nothing that could explain what she'd heard in room 17. When she returned to the hallway outside that room, an electrician named Daly was waiting with a thermal imager promised the night before. He was young, maybe 23, with bright eyes and a kind of earnest confidence that had not yet been tempered by impossible cases. "You want the walls scanned?" "All walls," she said. "Interior, exterior, floor and ceiling if possible." Daly powered up the device, and a soft hum filled the hallway. He began with the wall between 17 and 18. The screen showed soft blues and greens, consistent thermal patterns of insulated construction. As he moved downward, something flashed. A bloom of yellow, then orange, then quickly vanished. Calhoun straightened. "Go back." Daly slid the imager upward, slowly. Nothing. He lowered it again. Nothing. "It was right around here," he said, tapping the lower left quadrant of the wall. She crouched beside him, staring at the smooth beige paint, then pressed her hand to the same spot. Cool. Ordinary. She tried the thermal scan from the opposite angle. Nothing. A hallucination? A ghost thermal artifact? Or something that had moved? At 10:03 a.m., Investigator Ellison radioed from the county office. "Calhoun, we've got something from Denver PD. Might want to come take a look." She left the motel, driving through patches of half-melted snow toward Rawlins, her mind churning with a familiar loop, the impossible room, the silent walls, the tapping that should not exist. At the sheriff's office, Ellison placed a file on the table. Denver found something unusual in Whitaker's financials. Unusual how? 3 cash withdrawals. Same exact amount. $400 each. Made at 3 different ATMs. 3 consecutive nights before the storm. People take out cash. Not like this, Ellison said. He didn't normally carry cash. Credit cards for everything. And the timestamps, he pointed to the printed sheet. 1:39 a.m., 1:43 a.m., 1:41 a.m. All between 1 and 2 a.m. Yeah. And here's the thing. Ellison slid another sheet forward. Look where the ATMs are located. The first was in Laramie. The second in Walden, Colorado. The third in Rock Springs. That's hundreds of miles apart, Calhoun whispered. He couldn't have been in all those places. Not in 3 nights. Unless he wasn't the one who made the withdrawals. Or unless the timestamps aren't accurate. ATMs don't malfunction like that. Calhoun stared at the list. 3 nights. 3 towns. 3 identical cash withdrawals. And at 2:03 a.m. the night of the storm, a CB transmission, spoken in a voice that might be his. She pieced together a pattern she didn't like. 1:39 a.m. Laramie. 1:43 a.m. Walden. 1:41 a.m. Rock Springs. 2:03 a.m. Rawlins static. 17 not safe. Something was happening at night. Something tied to those hours. She drove back to the motel, unsettled. In room 17, she sat once more on the bed. The silence pressed in. She listened for the taps. None came. She pulled out Whitaker's notebook again, turning to the page he'd written the night before he vanished. Kept hearing tapping in walls. Asked front desk. No adjoining room. Something feels off. She closed her eyes and let the room speak in its own unsettling way. The heater clicked softly. The wind outside brushed the window. Then faintly, so faintly she might have imagined it, a shift in air pressure. A vibration in the frame. And then a soft, impossible sound. A faint exhale, like someone breathing inside the wall. Her eyes snapped open. She stood abruptly, backing away from the wall. But she kept listening. The exhale stopped. Silence resumed. At 6:02 p.m., a storm front rolled in from the west, smaller, lighter, but enough to rattle the building. Wind banged loose shutters. Snow dust flickered past the windows. The motel grew quiet as guests stayed inside. Calhoun didn't leave. She remained seated in the room with the lights off, listening. At 7:14 p.m., the building shifted with a sudden gust. The heater buzzed. The air warmed unnaturally. Then, 3 taps. Close. Not in the wall. Behind the headboard. She froze. The taps came again. 3. Even. Measured. Then, something new. A scraping sound. Slow. Like fingers dragging across drywall from the inside. She stepped back, breath tight in her chest. The scraping traveled horizontally, behind the bed, behind the nightstand, behind the small round table. It stopped under the window. Silence. Then, knuckles tapping glass. Once. Twice. 3 times. She looked at the curtains. They were still. No silhouette. No shadow. She approached slowly, each step measured. She pulled the curtain back an inch. No figure stood outside the window. No footprints marred the snow. The wind had settled. The glass was fogged faintly from interior heat. And at the bottom right corner of the pane, where frost had clung for days, a new shape had emerged. A smudge. From inside, 3 small, vertical streaks. Like someone with cold fingers had drawn them downward. Calhoun stared, breath suspended. Her mind churned through logical explanations. Condensation pattern, heat shift, fabric smear. But none aligned with the shape, the timing, the taps. She reached out and touched the glass. It was warm. Warmer than it should have been. She stepped back, every instinct in her body screaming that something in room 17 was active, present, responding. Not memory. Not echo. Not illusion. Something. She turned toward the door, her pulse hammering beneath her skin. As she reached for the handle, the heater clicked once more behind her, and the lamp on the nightstand flickered on by itself. The room glowed in a sudden pool of yellow light, illuminating the bed where Whitaker had last sat, the table where his papers had lain, the wall where she had heard tapping. And beside the lamp, in the thin dust she brushed earlier without thinking, lay something she had not seen before. A print. Not a fingerprint. A partial palm, pressed into the dust. Human. Fresh. Larger than Whitaker's. Larger than her own. Calhoun stared until her breath returned. She left the room slowly, never taking her eyes off that print, and closed the door behind her with a quiet click. Outside in the hallway, she leaned against the wall, heart pounding. Something had touched that nightstand. Something that was not in the room when investigators first swept it. Something that wasn't supposed to be there. Room 17 was no longer just the site of a disappearance. It was answering back. It was participating. And as snow began to fall again outside the motel windows, Calhoun realized something with a cold clarity that settled deep into her bones. Daniel Whitaker had not been the first person to encounter whatever lived in the walls of Room 17, and he would not be the last. By the sixth day, the case had drifted so far from the boundaries of conventional investigation that even the most grounded officers in Carbon County had begun lowering their voices when discussing Room 17, as though volume itself might stir something best left dormant. Investigator Ruth Calhoun arrived shortly after sunrise, sleep-deprived, jaw tight, heart still thrumming with the memory of the palm print she'd found the night before. She had photographed it, documented it, circled it in the log, but she had not touched it, nor had anyone else. She'd ordered the room sealed, double-taped, and placed under continuous watch. The motel's other rooms now sat nearly empty. Guests had fled during the early morning hours, some leaving keys on the lobby counter, others abandoning their deposits entirely. Red Kellerman stood near the coffee urn, rubbing his temples. "I'm shutting down for a week after this," he said. "Clean the carpets. Fix the roof. Exorcise the damn place, for all I care." Calhoun didn't answer. She had no energy to comfort him, no patience left to pretend the situation was containable. At 8:11 a.m., the Wyoming Division of Criminal Investigation returned with a specialist, Dr. Mara Hensley, a forensic analyst with a reputation for calm rationality in cases involving ambiguous trace findings. Hensley entered Room 17 with 2 technicians and a portable microscope unit. The palm print was still there, still clear, still inexplicably fresh. She examined it for 20 minutes, silent except for the occasional soft murmur to her team. When she finally turned to Calhoun, her expression carried a rare, unsettling uncertainty. "It's a print," she said simply. "Human male. Broad. Middle-aged. Based on ridge compression. Could it be Whitaker's? No. Too large. And the ridge spacing doesn't match the exemplar Denver provided. Could it belong to motel staff? Possibly," Hensley said. "But then we'd expect older dust displacement around it. This one was pressed recently. Within hours. And you confirmed no one has been in here overnight?" "Absolutely," Ellison said from the doorway. He'd kept watch from the hallway most of the night, dozing upright in a chair, waking at every creak of the floorboards. Nobody went in or out. Hensley moved to the heater next. The metal grate was warm, warmer than any unit ought to be in a closed room with no power draw. She took temperature readings, frowned, took them again. 78 degrees, she said quietly. Inconsistent with ambient temperature. "What's behind the heater?" Calhoun asked. "Standard insulation. No ductwork, no mechanical systems. Nothing that could heat itself. Not that I can explain." She scanned the wall with a handheld thermal meter. Again, nothing anomalous. No localized heat blooms. No cold gaps. No hint of anything behind the drywall. As if the warmth came from nowhere. As if the room itself was generating it. At 10:02 a.m., a call came from Dr. Ira Connolly, the Dr. Whitaker had spoken to about sleep disturbances. His voice was strained, trembling. "I remembered something else," he said. "Something Dan told me the last time we spoke." Calhoun stepped into the hallway, shutting the motel noise behind her. "Go ahead." "He said he'd been keeping a notebook," Connolly said. "Recording the episodes. Something about recurring dreams." "Dreams of what?" "Not dreams," Connolly corrected. "Not exactly. He said he would wake up disoriented, certain he'd been walking in his sleep, but the dreams felt more like displacement. Like he'd been somewhere else." "Somewhere else how?" "He said it felt like he'd been in another room. Same dimensions. Same furniture layout. But the walls were wrong. Too close. Too warm. Too dark." Calhoun's stomach tightened. He described the walls. "Yes. He said the air felt thick, like being inside a wall cavity. He thought it was stress. Or exhaustion." "Did he say how long he'd been having these dreams?" "Since early December." "Did he say they were getting worse?" "He said they were getting clearer." When she returned to Room 17, the technicians were swabbing the heater and gathering dust samples. Hensley looked up. "There's something else," she said. "We found a second print." "Where?" "On the inside of the closet door." Calhoun moved to the closet, heart pounding. On the smooth laminate surface, half hidden by the door's shadow, the partial impression of a fingertip curved across the panel. Small, narrow ridges. A different person. "Male?" Calhoun asked. Hensley shook her head. Female. And likely younger. Whitaker's wife. No. Ridge patterns don't match her exemplar either. Could the clerk have touched it? Not unless he has a very unusual ridge angle. This isn't his. Housekeeping. We checked. Hensley met her eyes. It doesn't match any known print associated with this motel. 2 prints. 2 unknown people. 2 separate points of contact. In a room sealed since the night of the disappearance. Calhoun stepped back, breathing shallowly. At noon, a sudden burst of power flickered through the building, lights dimming, then brightening, then dimming again. A surge. The emergency generator hummed for 3 seconds before disengaging. In room 17, the lamp turned itself on again. Every investigator froze. The heater clicked loudly. Then, 3 taps. From inside the wall. Ellison swore under his breath. A technician stepped back so quickly he knocked over a case of swabs. The taps came again, 3, then a pause. Then 3 more. Measured. Deliberate. Calhoun approached the wall, palms sweating inside her gloves. "We need the thermal camera," she said, voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Daly moved beside her, scanning the wall. The imager flickered, and for a moment, impossible but undeniable, a shape appeared. A temperature anomaly, human-shaped. A diffuse outline, pressed against the interior of the wall. Arms at its sides. Head slightly bowed. Then, gone. Daly stepped back, face pale. "No, no, 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 no. There's nothing in there," he whispered, scanning again, desperate for a rational explanation. "There's nothing inside that cavity. It's 4 inches deep. Nothing could be in there." But the imager had shown it anyway. A body. Or the impression of one. A presence that barely registered on the thermal scale. A ghost signature. "Check the other walls," Calhoun said. They scanned the wall to room 18. Normal. To the exterior. Normal. To the bathroom. Normal. They returned to the headboard wall. The shape flickered again. Fainter. Lower. Like something retreating deeper into the structure. "Could be a device," Daly said, breath shaking. "Some kind of RF interference." "There's no power line behind that wall," Hensley said. "No conduit. Nothing that could cause that." The heater clicked once more and fell silent. At 3:14 p.m., more results came from Denver. Something in Whitaker's ATM history matched a pattern from a cold case analysis. 3 other individuals had reported sleepwalking episodes combined with unexplained late-night withdrawals in the months before their disappearances. All 3 had vanished during winter storms. All 3 were commercial travelers. All 3 had stayed in isolated motels along the I-80 corridor. And one of them, an accountant from Idaho, had vanished from a room with a similar layout to room 17. Same builder. Same construction year. Same wall structure. Calhoun felt the floor shift under her feet. This was no longer a single disappearance. It was a pattern. A corridor. A series. And room 17 was part of it. At dusk, she made a decision she would later defend in 6 separate internal reviews and never once regret. "I'm staying in the room tonight," she said. "Alone." Ellison stared. "Absolutely not. We need to understand what he experienced. The tapping, the displacement, the timing aligns with early morning hours. I need to be here when it happens. Ruth, whatever is in that room touched the nightstand. It left prints. You can't, we need answers," she said. "And the room is giving them on its own schedule." After hours of argument, she won. At 11:52 p.m., she entered room 17 alone, closed the door, and locked it. The room hummed with a low, unnatural warmth. She placed a notebook on the table, a recorder beside the lamp, a flashlight at her feet. She turned off the overhead light but left the lamp on low. Midnight passed. Wind brushed the windows. Snow tapped against the glass. At 1:13 a.m., the heater hummed loudly, then went silent. At 1:31 a.m., the air grew warmer. Oppressively warm. At 1:39 a.m., the exact minute of Whitaker's first strange ATM withdrawal, the room shifted. Not the air. The room. As though the walls expanded and contracted by a fraction of an inch. The lamp flickered. Calhoun gripped the edge of the bed, breath sharp. At 1:43 a.m., Whitaker's second withdrawal time, the taps came. 3. Behind her. She turned slowly. The tapping moved. Behind the bathroom wall. Then the headboard. Then the closet door. 3 taps each time. Traveling. Circling. Coming closer. At 1:41 a.m., Whitaker's third timestamp, the room temperature spiked. Sweat beaded on her back. The lamp flickered off. Darkness swallowed the room. She reached for the flashlight. Her fingers met empty air. Something had moved it. A soft exhale, warm and moist, brushed her ear. Not wind. Not heater output. A breath. Inside the room. Behind her. Her pulse thundered. She turned, but the darkness was total. Then, 3 taps. On the inside of the headboard. And a voice faint low, as though vibrating through the walls themselves. Not again. She froze. Every nerve in her body screamed. The room shifted again. The air thickened. Something pressed against the wall from the inside. An indentation forming outward, the shape of a hand. Then a second hand. Then a face, barely perceptible, pressing the drywall forward as though someone, were trapped behind it. She staggered back, hitting the nightstand. The lamp flashed on, and the wall went still. The indentation vanished. The warmth dissipated. The room returned to silence. Calhoun stood trembling, one hand gripping the nightstand so tightly her knuckles whitened. On the wall, where the face had pressed outward, something remained. A new print. A partial forehead imprint. Human oil residue. Fresh. Impossible. She stayed in the room until dawn, shaking, waiting for the room to stir again. It didn't. But by sunrise, one thing was clear. The walls of room 17 did not just hide the truth of what happened to Daniel Whitaker. They were trying to reveal it, or warn her, or repeat it. And whatever had taken him, whatever had pressed through the drywall, breathing, tapping, moving, was not done. Not with the room. Not with the corridor. Not with her.